It's great to see you here on Lil'wat and Squamish territory, and a real honor for me to be here with my colleagues from across Western Canada and the North. It was a wonderful set of discussions at the conference. We had a very successful meeting and very grateful for their time. My apologies to the media. We're starting a little earlier than you may have expected. We were told we had to hit the Ontario newscast deadline. Just kidding. I grew up in Kitchener. I'm allowed to make Toronto jokes. They played particularly well in Western Canada. We had really productive discussion on our shared priorities. We have certainly big challenges in the West today. Many of us have grappled with very serious forest fires this season. We have issues around finding the people to fill the jobs that we have, to drive our economies, our provincial economies, our territorial economies forward. We have challenges around the cost of living and affordability for the people that we serve. But it's also a time of incredible opportunity for Western Canada. We see the weight of population growth shifting, the weight of the country to the west. We see that our provinces and territories offer the energy and the solutions to many of the problems that the world's economy faces, and the security to many countries that they're looking for around critical minerals and energy security, as well as what our own country is looking for. We had really important discussions about a number of topics of shared interest. In particular, we discussed strengthening our strategic infrastructure and trade corridors, finding ways to get our goods to market efficiently and effectively, to grow our provinces and territories' economies, but also our national economy. To collaborate on climate action and adaptation, including addressing issues of energy security both domestically and internationally, related to everything from electricity to energy products like LNG. We talked about how provinces and territories are key partners in the immigration system, how dependent we are on working together with the federal government around immigration to address issues of labor shortage, certainly, and also to ensure that people who arrive newly to our provinces and territories receive the support that they need. We talked about our labor market and the need to remove barriers to ensure labor mobility, but also to meet the needs that we have in our different provincial economies. The premiers from the North talked about the critical importance of Arctic sovereignty and preserving Canada's Arctic sovereignty, and it was that priority on that agenda item was supported by all premiers, as we recognize the importance of a free North and a sovereign North that is a critical part of Canada and is of interest internationally right now, especially following recent events. Finally, we discussed crime and the bail reform bill that was not passed at the federal level, and our shared urging to the federal government to prioritize the passage of that bill, and our shared deep disappointment that that bill was not passed in the recent parliamentary session. The last few years taught us, through the pandemic certainly, that we can solve big problems if we work together. And while we're not going to agree on everything, we are politicians, first of all, and we sometimes have challenges finding points of agreement. But actually, during our meetings, I think the focus, because we're focused on Canadians, because we're focused on our communities and who we represent, we found very broad areas of agreement, shared priority, and how we can work together to not just improve our own homes, but to really help build the Canada that we're all so proud of. We're all so proud to be a part of, and that Western Canada, we believe, will provide such prosperity to going into the future. So with that, I'd like to open it up for questions from the media. All premiers are prepared to answer questions, and I'll pass it over to our MC.
Thank you very much. A reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You will be limited to one question and one follow-up. We will begin with media here in the room. Our first question comes from Richard Zussman, Global News.
Premier Eby, you speak about growing pressure on Western Canada due to the population shifting west. is there a call from the premiers here to change the way that projects are funded from Ottawa to better compensate for that population growth or growing pressure to this part of the country?
Well, I'd certainly invite another premier to weigh in as well. But my feeling was, from our conversations today, that we see huge opportunity in the growing numbers of people that are choosing to live, in particular in Western Canada, in the north. But we also see challenges that come with that if that's not done in a thoughtful way. That the need for the federal government to work with us to ensure that we're targeting immigration that helps address pressures that we see in our labor markets. So in British Columbia, certainly around construction, around childcare, skilled trades. We all discussed the need for healthcare workers, making sure that we're leveraging immigration and in partnership with the federal government to make sure that we're growing our populations, but also growing our economies. And the only way we can do that is to do it in a coordinated way. The second piece that stood out for me from the conversation was how critical it is that the supports are in place for new arrivals. We talked in particular about new arrivals from Ukraine and making sure that they have the support that they need when they're arriving in provinces under that special federal government program that is going to be renewed in mid-July. And treats that particular population differently than other refugees coming to Canada. And so making sure that there are supports there, not just for Ukrainian refugees, but for new arrivals generally, including international students, temporary foreign workers, and others under federal programs, including people immigrating through regular pathways, is critically important for all of us. I wonder if there's another premier that is interested in sharing a perspective on the immigration issue.
The only other thing I might add is the importance of having per capita funding with no strings attached, so that each jurisdiction has the ability to identify the projects that are important to them, so that they can continue to grow with their needs. Acknowledging that small jurisdictions like the territories need a special arrangement so that they can ensure that they've got the funding support. We're also interested in equivalency and fairness. I think that if the federal government wants to help support those projects, they need to be mindful of providing some kind of equivalency in each jurisdiction. Those are some of the other issues that were raised.
And to the point of equivalency in it, this may be for Premier Smith. I'd also like to hear from Premier Eby on this as well. Is this more money to Western Canada and less to Ontario and Quebec, or is this more money for all provinces from the federal government? How would that sort of breakdown work, considering the pressures we're feeling here in the West that may be different than what they're seeing in Ontario and Quebec?
Thanks. I won't speak for the whole table, but certainly from British Columbia's perspective, one of the messages that we continually send to the federal government is whether it's housing money, whether it's money for economic development related to climate, and ensuring that we're competitive in the global transition that's happening, whether it's funding for Indigenous housing, whether it's funding for infrastructure, that British Columbia needs to see at least our fair share on a per capita basis with other provinces. And again, we recognize the unique needs of places like the territories, like the North, to have special arrangements. But I have been concerned, and I've shared that concern federally, that BC has not seen our fair share of this type of funding. And you'll see in the communique the emphasis from all provinces that needs to be a key consideration of the federal government for funding programs. It doesn't mean that other provinces need to be funded less. It means that the funding that's available from the federal government needs to be distributed fairly.
Yeah, I would agree with Premier Eby on all of that. And you know, our natural resource-based economies, innovation-based economies in the western half of our nation are growing. You know, for example, in Saskatchewan, we're growing at our fastest rate from a population perspective that we have in 108 years, over a century, since we've grown at the rate that we are. And I think that's true in many of the western provinces. And so there is concerns, I think, at least from Saskatchewan's perspective, and likely others, around fair and equitable treatment, investing in the settlement services, for example, of new immigrants, including Ukrainian immigrants that are coming to our communities. There's concerns around the investments that are being made in that that very economy, and as we are finding our way to not only producing products, energy products, for example, that have been used in the past or being used today, but as we prepare to produce those products that are going to be in demand tomorrow, the rare earth elements, the lithium, those types of products. And so I think we would share in some of the fair and equitable balance of investment, not only in the advancement of and preservation of the jobs in the strong economies that we have in our respective provinces and territories, but also in supporting those that are coming to participate in that economy as we grow our province's population and we grow our community's population, and those services are necessary and need to be provided. And so we discussed that that fair and equitable investment by other levels of government, namely the federal level of government. We, I think, look forward to continuing that discussion right through to the Council of Federation table.
Okay. So I'd like to add on from the north. The other ones can join if they want. The north is different. When you talk about equitable services, then you need to think of the north, and I think that all the premiers at this conference have agreed, and that's why they identified that the north is different. We are at the forefront of climate change. We're at the forefront of Arctic security and safety, which people are now paying attention to. We have infrastructure gaps that are huge that people don't realize. We have no road systems to many of our communities. Some of us to any of our communities. The energy sources are not there. We're reliant on diesel. We don't have the telecommunications that people take for granted here. So when we talk about equity, we need to make sure that the people in the Northwest Territory, or the North period, have the same level of services that people in the South take for granted. So yeah, I do think that there needs to be a redistribution of the wealth, and I do think that the federal government needs to not only give large funding to the eastern provinces, I think they need to take care of the West and the North. We are all Canadians, and we all deserve to prosper. Thank you.
Our next question from the room comes from Benoit Ferradini, CBC Radio-Canada.
Hello. My question is about climate action. Can you detail what you request from the federal, and also are there different views depending on where climate change had the most impact, provinces or territories?
Thanks. There was broad interest across the table from all premiers and certainly from all Canadians about reducing carbon pollution and addressing climate change. I would say that there was certainly some anxiety around the table from premiers, from some jurisdictions, particularly around timelines related to decarbonizing the electrical generation systems in their provinces. British Columbia is fortunately in a position of having a lot of hydroelectricity and the ability to support jurisdictions other than ours. So certainly part of the conversation was how do we support each other in sharing our strengths. And one of those that British Columbia was able to put on the table is if we can find ways to intertie with, for example, with the Yukon to support them in their efforts to access more electricity to grow their economy and decarbonize their electrical grid, then that's very good news for everybody. And so that was what my takeaway was from the discussion, was that we need to look to each other's strengths to support each other in the work that we need to do, and that the federal government in their programs needs to look at each province in terms of our strengths and also where we're going to need additional support and consideration for the unique positioning of our provinces. I wonder if there's another premier that is interested in.
Sure. I mean, I can weigh in as well. I mean, obviously, it won't surprise you that the $13 billion investment in Ontario's battery factory and the Atlantic Loop and the significant investment came up. And we've got equivalent investments that need to be made in Western Canada. We've got carbon capture, utilization, and storage in Alberta. We've got hydrogen. We've got various jurisdictions exploring small modular nuclear. We've got the strategic infrastructure that needs to be built in the northern communities with ports, as well as rail access so that we can get critical minerals to market. And so seeing that the federal government's prepared to make those kinds of investments in Eastern Canada is fantastic, and we support those kind of investments. That's what I'm talking about with equivalency, is that there has to be a recognition that if we're going to address these issues, we have to address them in different ways in each jurisdiction, and there has to be a similar amount of interest and investment from the federal government.
Yeah, I really appreciated the conversation about collaboration today, and speaking with Premier Eby and focusing on for us in the Yukon the potential of a grid connection. It's foundational to our ability to reduce our emissions and to meet our climate change goals. We're having a season this year where we're lucky we can deploy resources to our neighbors that are dealing with fires, and our flooding season has been minimal this year. But I mean, the collaboration is going to be key. I think, as Premier Eby said, there's strengths that we all can lean on. For us, a grid connection in British Columbia, the early stage conversation, that opportunity not only will drive a northwestern Canadian economy when it comes to critical minerals, and do it in the cleanest way possible, but it is also going to help us meet our overall goals. So I think the support from the premiers, and especially from the provinces, and as Premier Cochrane touched on, understanding the uniqueness of the North and having the provincial leaders from Western Canada stand by us and understand and support us is so important coming to these meetings, and I just really appreciate that over the last 2 days.
To add a bit as well, I think the most impacted region by climate change is right in the north. We see it daily as people who rely so heavily in terms of the ice. And really the discussions that we've had were really powerful in terms of our ability to see nation-building projects such as the Akeeagok hydro and fiber link that really would allow us to be able to get away from diesel. But right now there's no outside solutions that allow us to be able to get out of diesel as we move forward. But we do have the solutions, as David mentioned, in terms of solutions that really allow us to see nation investments really in the north, in western Nunavut in particular. I look at the Grays Bay Road and Port as a project where really there's 22 of the 31 critical minerals that we could provide not only to Canadians but to the world that really would unlock these incredible resources, and that would really create incredible jobs that tie obviously to the climate change that we see. So the discussions that we've seen and have had here has been really fruitful from the lens that there's such an infrastructure deficit in the north that it's important to recognize that gap, and for us to really play a leading role in terms of providing those solutions as we move forward as well in light of climate change.
If I can just add on one thing to that as well. As stated, the North feels climate change 4 times as the South. And I appreciate Premier from Nunavut actually speaking and saying we don't have a choice. Most of our communities, all of our communities, except for a couple, all of Nunavuts, are reliant on diesel. We don't have an option to get off at this point. So my point is that you can't make one policy to fit all of Canada. It doesn't work. The carbon tax is a huge example of that. It's an incentive so that people will get off and use renewable energy. Great incentive, except when you don't have any alternative, what it became is a punishment to people in the north. We're experiencing climate change. Our animals are migrating that we don't know. Our elders aren't able to read the land anymore. Our fires we're experiencing fires in the south. We've got flooding in the north. We've got snow in communities. This is all in the last week. And so one policy throughout Canada will not work. It's important that the federal government work with all jurisdictions to identify what we know. We live there, so we need to have a say on what policies will be implemented for us. Thank you.
Our next question comes from Chuck Chang, Canadian Press. Chuck, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. My question is directed towards Premier Smith. The federal government announced this morning that, speaking of both infrastructure and climate change, the federal government mentioned that they are tying future infrastructure transfers to whether or not a project is resilient to climate change. I was hoping to get your reaction to this, about this type of, whether this impacts your view in terms of how to approach future infrastructure transfers or projects, or working with the federal government on that front.
Well, I'll have to see what they mean by that. I mean, part of what we just went through an historic fire season, and part of the thing that we need to concentrate on is how do we build fire guards for community and be proactive for that. We also know that with flooding, there's infrastructure we need to build to make communities more resilient against flooding. Those are the two biggest risks that we face in our province. Some of those require just major infrastructure investments. So I'd be curious to see what they would have in mind. I mean, I'm prepared to work with the federal government on things that make sense for Alberta. What makes sense for Alberta, since we are a natural gas basin and we are a hydrocarbon fueled economy, is working on carbon capture, utilization and storage, working on hydrogen, working with our partners in British Columbia in particular on exporting LNG so that we can reduce emissions around the world. And those are the kind of investments that I'm hoping to be able to partner with them on.
Sorry, and Premier, one quick follow-up from our Edmonton Bureau. We were wondering if you have any reaction to the doctors in Alberta calling for a possible ethics investigation into Dr. Henshaw's dismissal. Thank you.
No, I have a person I've hired at the head of Alberta Health Services, Dr. John Cowell, to make personnel decisions. He makes personnel decisions. It's up to him to answer those questions.
Okay, we have a last question in the room before we go to the phones. We'll hear from Mira Baines, CBC.
Sure, and this question is for Premier Eby. This is about interprovincial trade barriers. What solutions were discussed around that the federal government can help with?
Thanks for the question, Mira. The key discussion around the table in terms of barriers to trade really focused on the transportation and logistics issues of getting goods to market and making sure that there's access to international markets for products from provinces. The discussion was very constructive. We're going to continue to work together to identify ways that we can ensure that there are strong trade corridors to make sure that for everything from telecommunications to energy products to transporting goods, that we're able to work together in an integrated and strategic way to be able to deliver these goods, and so that we don't face barriers like traffic bottlenecks, that we don't face barriers like incredibly lengthy, by which I mean decade-long approvals processes, and that we're able to deploy and respond quickly to what the needs are in the market and to take advantage of what we all agree is a remarkable time of opportunity for Western Canada to respond to the world's interest in our products. We don't want to miss this window. And so working on removing those barriers was the key focus of our discussion.
Okay. Yeah, so this question is for Premier Smith. Today, Federal Environment Minister said Canada isn't ready for the impact of climate change, that it has a lot of work to do. Why does your government continue to stall the transition to more sustainable sources of energy?
We don't stall anything. We just don't accept that oil and natural gas should be phased out. And by the nature of your question, I'm assuming that's what you think needs to happen. I totally disagree. We are going to reduce emissions, and we're going to reduce emissions by carbon capture, utilization, and storage, by transitioning to hydrogen, and by working with our partners to export LNG. We're going to have continued use of hydrocarbon fuels for petrochemicals. Dow Chemical has a zero emissions petrochemical plant that they're close to making a final investment decision on. Air Products is making a net zero hydrogen investment. Our oil sands are making a net zero investment by 2050. We're increasingly seeing bitumen beyond combustion for the use of bitumen for asphalt, which is a construction material. And so that's the framework we need to get into, is that we are not transitioning away from hydrocarbons. We are not transitioning away from oil and natural gas. We're transitioning away from emissions. And we have embraced the 2050 target.
Going to the phones now, a reminder to media on the line, please press *1 to enter the queue. You'll be limited to one question and one follow-up. Our first question from the phones comes from Jonathan Bradley, Western Standard.
Hello, Premier Eby. You mentioned when you were speaking that you guys had taken steps. You guys were speaking about steps to address labor shortages. What steps do you intend on taking?
Thanks, Jonathan. Great question. So we shared around the table steps that we're taking within our own provinces to address everything from healthcare worker shortages to skilled trade work shortages. For example, in BC, we have the Future Ready Skills Program. We also talked about the fact that the federal government programs that support the skills training that we do in our provinces is in BC is coming to an end as a result of a court decision about official languages, and that we're entering into renegotiations, but that generally the federal government has indicated that they're wanting to renegotiate those agreements as well, and the need for flexibility for provinces to be able to determine training needs and deliver training programs in our provinces. We talked about how, as a good partner with the federal government on immigration, that we can tailor our provincial nominee programs to address critical labor shortages in our markets in a way that the federal government simply can't do, and the need for the federal government to lean on us more, to see us as a true partner in immigration, to be able to ensure that their initiatives around welcoming new arrivals to Canada is as successful as possible. I wonder if Premier Stefanson, if you have any.
Sure. Yeah. Just to add to that, we also discussed labor shortages within healthcare. So health human resources is a very significant issue right across the country, including in Western Canada. And so we had a very good discussion about how we can share practices and how we can learn from each other and what is working in various jurisdictions. I know in Manitoba, I talked about our health human resource action plan, which is about recruiting, retaining, and training more healthcare professionals, really aligning what is needed with post-secondary institutions, as well on the training side, looking at immigration as a tool there. Recently, we just we signed on with the Philippines. We signed more than 300 healthcare professionals to come to the province of Manitoba. These are some of the things that we're looking at doing and breaking down the barriers for those that are trained elsewhere and looking at recognizing their credentials as well. And so these are some of the issues that that we talked about specific to healthcare. And I believe Premier Eby touched on other labor market challenges as well, but certainly it's really that alignment between post-secondary as well as what is needed in our business community as well.
Follow up, Jonathan.
So my follow-up question is, you mentioned during your opening remarks, Premier Eby, that public safety and crime was an issue that you spoke about at length. What do you want to see done to solve crime and public safety issues?
Thanks, Jonathan. Premier shared feedback around the table in terms of what we're doing in our provinces to address the issues of violent crime in community and issues of mental health and addiction that often impact people's feelings of safety and as well compromise the safety of those who are living outside or struggling with addiction in our streets. And there are a number of really important initiatives taking place across Western Canada to address these issues. And it's really helpful for us to get together and share what we're doing and to learn from each other. There was lots of, can I visit this initiative that you're doing? Can I talk to your staff member that's leading that work? That information sharing is critically important and welcome for me and I think for all of us throughout the discussion. But specifically, we all struggled to understand the decision that was made in the federal parliament not to call the bail reform bill. This is something that was a focus at the Council of Federation. All of the premiers across Canada agreed that this was a priority. The police have called on the federal government to make this change. And the bill was drafted, went through first reading, and then wasn't called for second reading. It didn't make it past first reading, and is now deferred until at least the fall. So we made a point in our communique of underlining our deep disappointment that that was the case, that the bill didn't get called and passed. We understand it has the support of all the parties in the provincial or in the federal parliament. and calling on the federal government to get this bill passed at the first opportunity in the fall session because of the urgency of the matter. I wonder if there's another premier that wants to speak on the issue of public safety.
Sure, I can just touch on it briefly. I think you covered most of the areas, but I think it's very important to just emphasize the fact that we are all united across the country as premiers and ministers of justice and public safety on calling on the federal government for bail reform. We were happy when they listened to us and brought forward a bill, but of course they have not followed through on that. And of course, if those changes are not made for bail reform, obviously it has a significant impact in our communities, and we're seeing that right across the country. But I think what's also important is that the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police, we met with them as a Council of Federation, and we heard loud and clear from them that they needed our support as well when it comes to bail reform. And so we were united on this front, and I think I would just reiterate the importance of this. We need to make sure that those violent offenders do not continue to get out on bail. We need to make sure that this reform takes place as quickly as possible.
And I might just add that the companion to the discussion is the issue of how we address mental health and addiction, and all of the premiers have a number of programs in place to address mental health and addiction treatment and taking a recovery approach. In Alberta, of course, we've got a recovery-oriented system of care that forms the basis for how we address mental health and addiction issues. And we've got 11 recovery communities that we're building. But each of the premiers know that there's sort of two sides to this. There's those who are the victims of this disease, and the victim of those who are peddling these poisonous opioids. And then there are those who are on the crime side that we've got to make sure that we're addressing that side of it too.
Our next question comes from George Antunes, Nunatsiaq News. George, please go ahead.
Hello there. This question is for, thank you first of all, everyone, but this question is for Premier PG Akeeagok. Regarding the Premier's, hold on one second, sorry. The Senate National Security Committee is going to release its report on Arctic security. A year ago, you and the territorial premiers demanded and got a meeting with the PM on Arctic security. So obviously this is an important issue to you. Have you been briefed on what recommendations the Senate will make in its report, and what would be helpful for the Senate to recommend?
Yeah, thank you, George, for that question. First, I just want to thank my colleagues here from the North in particular. With what we saw with Ukraine, the single shift in terms of the attention of the North really came in terms of the vulnerabilities we have in terms of the Arctic security and sovereignty. And I can't thank my friends around the room here in terms of the support we've received in terms of really putting the attention to the issues that we see here. And I really feel it's important to again signal the infrastructure deficit we see in the North has really made Canada vulnerable in terms of where we stand globally as a country. We're aware, and we are looking at the recommendations that have gone through in terms of the House of Commons as well as in terms of the Senate as well. In terms of key infrastructure areas we'd like to see move forward. So I'm sure the Chair, Caroline, would like to add as well in terms of this very important topic.
Thanks, PJ. I think the point that I'd like to make is again, one policy doesn't fit all, and the North is unique. It's got some real great strengths there, and it's got some real challenges there. So it's inappropriate for any government, the federal government, to make the assumption that they know what's necessary in the North and they will take care of our safety. I've seen too many people come from the South and come up to the North and think they know what they're getting into and come out with frostbite, vehicles sunk in the ice, being lost, having to get rescued. So I think the big thing is that if we are talking about Arctic safety and Arctic sovereignty, it's important that Canada talk with us, that they actually consult with us, not just listen, but actually hear us. because there are a lot of things that we know that are different from the South, and I'd hate to see Canada make the mistake and think that they know best when it comes to taking care of the safety of Canadians. They have an obligation to work with us. We have an obligation to make sure that all Canadians are safe, and the North is vulnerable. The sea is opening up. So work with us. We want to make sure that all Canadians are safe, but Canada cannot do it alone.
I think what I really appreciated today was the support again from premiers across Western Canada. The work that Carolyn and PJ have been focused on has been going on for years when it comes to this conversation. What we need Canadians to understand is that investment into the North it's almost a triple threat in the opportunities. One, it's securing the sovereignty of the North. Two, it's opening up economic opportunities. We know that critical minerals are going to be key towards our future transition, and the North has lots, and it's going to be infrastructure investment, whether it's telecommunications, electrical grids, new roadways, all of those things, port development are all key. And third, it's really about Arctic security. Most news outlets will know we were in the Yukon on the front line of an object being shot down. We learned a lot in early February from that experience. We think there needs to be more active conversation with the federal government. Premier Cochrane's done a great job chairing the Northern Premiers Table, and but I think all three premiers, we would all say we feel there has to be more of an active dialogue, and so we're looking towards the findings. But I think what I again really appreciated was there was a sense of the meetings I believe today where we were all looking at nation building opportunities. There was a push towards being able to look at big projects, how they're important to Canada, and the aspirations of Western Canada. And that's the energy that we need when we think about the North, that things are possible, but they're big ideas, but they have to be put in place if we're going to compete with the other circumpolar nations.
George, do you have a follow-up?
No, I don't. Thank you.
Our next question comes from the phones, and we will go to Mike Ruddick of CBC Whitehorse.
Hello. I guess my question is for Premier Ranj Pillai. Just wanted to know, how much money would you like to see the Yukon get in federal funding to boost infrastructure because of the effects of climate change?
I believe it's a case-by-case basis. There's so many different areas that we have to look at, whether it's climate change adaptation mitigation. We've watched and looked at best practices from British Columbia and Alberta after significant events, whether that's large fire breaks, that type of work. So I think it would be, I can't put a dollar figure on it at this point. I think what we do want to see is we want to see a federal government that understands there is a uniqueness to the North. When you look at the tenders that we have going out from our capital budget is, it's really strained because of the extra costs that we're seeing across the country. And so I believe we want to make sure that the federal government understands the unique circumstances. I really appreciate coming out of these meetings with the support of the Western premiers, which means a lot, going to the table. And that's something that both Carolyn and PJ have always been able to pull together. So it'll be, what is the next type of infrastructure program Canada has? What does it look like? How is it going to roll out? And will it be flexible and understand the uniqueness of each jurisdiction? That's what's on my mind.
Mike, do you have a follow-up?
Yes. Again, this is for Premier Pillai. Just maybe if you, it's been a year since the last Western Conference meetings, and I'm just wondering, have you seen an improvement in the federal government, what they're doing to help with to strengthen Arctic sovereignty here in the North?
I think the conversation's changed. In January, the focus became all of a sudden this very significant situation that occurred, and we were collectively we were all in Ottawa working on the Canadian healthcare transfer. there was conversations Yukon delegation had with the Department of Defense. We identified the fact that we thought threat. That happened on Thursday. There was smiles, I think, from the folks that we met with, that we were maybe our imagination was getting the best of us. And then on Saturday, we were seeing deployment of Canadian military into the north. So the conversation's changed a lot. People are very focused on it. Our neighbors and our allies that are part of NATO in the circumpolar north know it's important. And, you know, I would just say that the provinces have been incredible in supporting the territories. And we just want to make sure that we're collectively at the table with the federal government making decisions. I'll touch on one piece. When you take into consideration how long it takes in our country to build a very substantial project like a port in Nunavut or a port in Northwest Territories or the Yukon, and you think about all the steps it has to take and the time, we're behind already. So we need to invest now, and we need to be able to look into the next 10 and 20 years as shipping routes open up. Those are the things that we talked about, and the table was very supportive in those conversations.
If I can add on to that as well, I think that the federal government is starting to pay attention a little bit more to the north. Of course, they have to because of what's going on. I do believe that at the beginning, the federal government thought that they know what is best. They talked about military, they talked about warships, things that in the Northwest Territories, we don't pay attention to those things. We don't have those. But what they fail to realize, and I think they're coming to the realization now, is that, like I said, what people take for granted in the south is a luxury in the north. I don't think they realize that they need dual purpose infrastructure such as hospitals, telecommunications, airports, road systems. And I think that at the beginning they thought they were fine, they had all the answers, and I think now that they're starting to realize that maybe they don't have all the answers. And so if they want to address Arctic safety, then they need to address Arctic sovereignty at the same time, and that means dual infrastructure should be something that they're paying attention to.
Just if I could as well, I think the conversation has shifted, but we haven't yet seen any investment of that to the magnitude that we need to see from the lens of nation building in terms of Arctic security and sovereignty. So we come to the table, I think, with strong solutions, whether it's corridors that we've talked about here in the Western Conference, but also really energy security that we've talked about, whether it's the Akeeagok hydro link, whether it's the Iqaluit hydro that's been discussed. Really that provides that dual purpose, but we have yet seen any major investment that comes to address the issue that came here. So I just wanted to add that as well.
To add one other piece on how this conversation has changed, and we discussed this as well, and I think many provincial premiers would agree with respect to we need an all of Canada approach to our sovereignty in the north. This is part of our country, and most certainly we need to have an all of Canada approach, all of Canada supporting not only our Arctic sovereignty, the security of our north, and we can do that through a number of different ways, through advancing some of the, as you say, the circumpolar relationships that we have with other countries, including the United States, with Alaska in that region. Prime Minister was in the Nordic countries here just this past week, but also through activity in the north, activity through, we talked about connectivity, whether it be roads, whether it be communications, whatever that might be, improving the connectivity to our northern communities. And ultimately, some of the result of that is advancing our economic interests for the folks that live in the north, and for and what's good for our northern territories most certainly is good for our nation. And I think part of the conversation that is also changing is the priority on Arctic sovereignty, Arctic security that we are seeing from maybe the 10 southern provinces.
We have time for a final question. It goes to Saif Kaiser, Global Edmonton. Saif, please go ahead.
Thanks so much. Good afternoon for Danielle Smith, Madam Premier. In these conversations with your counterparts across other provinces, it seems infrastructure was a key issue. So when it comes to pipelines, the energy sector specifically, what sort of conversations have you had with other premiers regarding building or coordinating any future energy projects, and how do you balance those with the potential environmental impact?
I think what you'll find the premiers share a common cause in is building out strategic infrastructure and economic corridors, and it looks different depending on which direction we're going. That I think what you'll find is if we can identify the zones that will make the most sense from an economic development point of view for each region, then we can work backwards and figure out how we build the infrastructure. And it could be roads, it could be rail, it could be transmission infrastructure, it could be pipelines, it could be internet access, broadband, fiber. So I think that's where we need to get to in a conversation is how can we in the West work together with our strategic partners to build out that infrastructure so that we can get all of the products that we need to market. It certainly isn't just a single issue around oil pipelines or natural gas pipelines or hydrogen pipelines. It also includes a discussion about how we get critical minerals to market.
I would just add to that as well. We had a great discussion and even went beyond the national transportation infrastructure that we have, but really starting at the market. And you know what we do across much of this great nation is we export products to other areas of the world, and we export some of the most sustainable products available in the world, and we most certainly should recognize that. And so you look at and Premier Smith had brought this forward, and we had a good discussion around, look at the market where these products are actually arriving, these sustainable products, back to the port, and what can we do to work collaboratively on ensuring that our ports have the capacity not only for today but for the products of tomorrow. Then our in-nation transportation systems, whatever that might be, whether it be rail, whether it be pipe, whether it be highway, whether it be air, or roads for that matter, and how we are prepared with our in-nation transportation infrastructure to get those products, to continue to get those products to that port and ultimately to that market, and then right back to the production site, and realizing that many of the products that we are producing here in this nation are some of the most sustainable products that you can find on earth. And we had a discussion about our nation, and there's an article out a couple of days ago with respect to some of the divisions that we're seeing across this nation, and we most certainly, I think, have a role to play in that as subnational leaders in bringing this nation back together and ensuring that we are being proud of not only what we're producing in Canada from coast to coast to coast, but how we are producing those products. And so we had a good discussion about, for instance, I can speak to Saskatchewan, but each premier can speak to the products that they're producing. We produce some of the lowest carbon agri-food products that you can find on earth, and we're now exporting some of the innovation in that industry that's helping other areas of the world, the US, Australia, Ukraine, India, produce similar or more sustainable goods. The same with the energy products coming out of the oil products coming out of Saskatchewan, 25% lower carbon emissions per barrel of oil than their global counterparts. Net zero oil company operating in our province. Potash, half the emissions of their competitors around the world. We need to be equally proud of products that are produced as people in Saskatchewan in other areas of Canada, and really get back to supporting one another, because what's good in Ontario for Ontario communities is good for Canada, and that's good for Saskatchewan. What's good for British Columbia communities is good for not only the economy and the families that are residing in British Columbia, but it's good for all of us as Canadians. And it's high time, and I think each of us have a role in bringing our nation back together and being proud of one another from coast to coast to coast on not only what we produce, how we produce it, and what opportunities we each have in our respective regions as we look 5 and 10 years down the road.
If I could just jump in there too as well, and I think you've touched on it, but I think this was like a start of a discussion today that is really exciting, I think, for our country, not just for Western Canada, but for our country. And I think, from this, and as chair of our Council of Federation, this is something today that from a high level we want to take nationally and have that discussion about a national transportation and trade strategy and infrastructure strategy across the country. And so we touched on that today. We started to get into all the exciting things within each of our territories and our provinces. There's a lot of exciting things happening out there. But I think we want to take this as well and have that discussion at the Council of Federation as well. So lots of more exciting things, and as Scott said, bringing our country together in a very positive way, I think is what will come out of it.
Saif, do you have a follow-up?
Yes, I do. Again, for Premier Smith, I want to follow up on a question you were asked probably like a dozen ago now. You say you put John Cowell in place to field questions like why Dr. Dina Hinshaw was given a job, accepted the job, and then unhired the following day or the following day after it became public. But Cowell's not commenting. Alberta Health Services isn't commenting. I know you won't comment on that personnel change, so I won't ask you to. Instead, I'll say that over 100 doctors signed a letter alleging political interference and they want an investigation. So yes or no, was there any political interference? And how do you ensure Albertans that there wasn't any, as you've made it clear numerous times before you were elected that you're not a fan of Dina Hinshaw?
Look, we have a lot of change that we need to make in Alberta Health Services. Is the reason why I dismissed the board and put in an official administrator is so that we could accelerate many of the decisions that need to be made. And there's going to be a lot more decisions that have to come. And there's going to be a lot of personnel changes that have to come. And that's why I've delegated that to Dr. John Cowell to make those personnel changes. And we are going to make sure that we've got a system that focuses on the front line and focuses on having the right people in the right position doing the right thing. Our mental health and addiction strategy is led by Mental Health and Addiction, Dan Williams, and I would encourage you to talk to him about what the strategy is going to be there. But I think people should expect that there's going to be a lot of change in our health system over the coming weeks and months as we make sure that we address the issues that have been chronic problems for literally decades. And that's what we're going to be focused on. And Dr. John Cowell's had his contract extended 6 months, and he's going to be leading that effort and making those personnel decisions. So those are the kind of questions you'd have to put to him.
Thank you very much, everybody. That concludes today's conference.